In 2012, an archaeological dig in Israel uncovered a small stone seal. The seal, which is perhaps an inch in diameter, dates to the 11th or 12th century BCE and depicts a man battling a lion. Ordinarily, such a small artifact would seem insignificant, but this was found in the ancient city of Beth Shemesh, the home of the legendary Samson. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. Before we dive into the Samson story, I want to ask you all to stick around after the end of the episode for a quick announcement. The story of Samson, the most widely known figure from the book of Judges, begins in chapter 13 with his conception and ends in chapter 16 with his death in the temple of Dagon. Since we've already gone into detail about Dagon in the Joshua episodes, I won't dive too deeply into the murky waters of that strange deity here, but his temple will come up again later in this episode. The name Samson is derived from the word semes, which means sun, which shouldn't be at all surprising considering the amount of solar imagery associated with the character. Semes, or Shamash, was also the name of the Sumerian sun god, who was the twin brother of Inanna, the queen of heaven. Shamash was also called Utu, but I'll stick with Shamash to avoid confusion for the duration of this episode, since his name will come up again. The story begins with a man named Manoah, who was descended from the Danites we discussed in episode 30. Like so many men in the Bible before him, Manoah had a barren wife, and so couldn't have children to inherit his property. So Yahweh sends an angel to announce to Manoah's wife that she will bear a son, and instructs her to not drink wine or eat anything unclean, because her son is to be a Nazarite. Also, he must never cut his hair. Now, since I can't recall if I covered this during the episode about the book of Numbers, and I'm too lazy to go back and check, I'll go over it here. A Nazarite was a person who took a voluntary vow to separate themselves from the rest of the community through self-consecration. They would not cut their hair, allowing it to grow long. They would abstain from wines, grapes, vinegar, raisins, and any intoxicants. And they would become and remain ritually pure by not coming in contact with corpses and following all the other kosher laws that go along with it. This was usually a temporary vow lasting a month or perhaps longer, though traditions do speak of permanent Nazarites who took these vows for life. Samson, on the other hand, was chosen by Yahweh to be a Nazarite before his birth and must remain one for his entire life. This may be seen as a cautionary tale for those who take the vows and consider breaking them, as the story doesn't go well for Samson once his hair is shorn. Though it should be noted that Nazarites frequently cut their hair immediately before taking the vow, for the sake of convenience, and permanent Nazarites were allowed to cut their hair once per year if it became bothersome. But here in chapter 13, Samson is set up as a proto-Nazarite. He's a sort of unachievable ideal of what these Bronze Age holy men aspired to be, though there's no sign that anyone believed they'd obtained superpowers for taking these vows. Those powers come from his demigod status, which brings us back to the story. Manoah learns of the angelic visit from his wife and pleads with Yahweh for another visit so he can learn more information. Again, the angel visits the barren woman, who fetches Manoah, who then offers a sacrifice of a goat to the angel, but the angel turns it down because he doesn't eat and suggests that the offering be made to Yahweh instead. Manoah does this, offering the goat up on his own stone altar, and the goat is suddenly consumed by flames, which appear out of nowhere, and then the angel rides the flames up into heaven. Now, a few things should be noted here. First, this angel is the most detached heavenly being we've seen thus far. Previous angels, and even gods, ate and drank and didn't fly up into the sky, but instead walked along roads. While the story of Samson is ancient, this depiction of the angel is from a time when their theology was a bit more evolved. The next thing to consider is that this was originally a direct visitation by Yahweh himself, not an angel. Angels were often sent to interact with mortals, because it was believed that observing Yahweh directly could be lethal. Yet in Judges 13:21-23, we learn that Manoah believed he would die from speaking with this entity. But the text states that Yahweh did not want them to perish from witnessing him, and he indicated that by accepting their offering and then announced the rules for raising up Samson. The character is changed to an angel, but the references still mention a personal visitation by Yahweh. It's another instance where the redactor overlooked crucial details when updating the story to fit the Deuteronomic theology. Though I will mention that the editors are getting a bit better. The angel here speaks of Yahweh in the third person, whereas all previous scenes have the angel saying stuff like, I, Yahweh, command such and such. Lastly, I'd like to point out that in the myth of Etana, a Babylonian legend, Etana receives help from the sun god, Shamash, to conceive a child with his barren wife. And this is just one of many connections between the character of Samson and the sun god Shamash. Though the Babylonian story is a bit more elaborate, it involves an eagle, a snake, a carcass of a bull, and a magic plant. Anyway, 9 months later, the barren woman gives birth to a proud little demigod whom she names Samson. As he grows, so does his hair, arranging itself into 7 long locks, which parallels nicely to the long locks of Shamash, which represent the rays of the sun. One day, a Philistine woman catches Samson's eye, and he asks his parents to obtain her as a wife for himself. His motives are plainly stated. If she becomes his wife, he has a beautiful woman, but if the Philistines refuse, he then has reason to go to war with them. He's essentially spoiling for a fight and looking for any excuse to start swinging. On the way down to arrange the marriage, Samson is attacked by a lion. Like Hercules, he fights off the lion and kills it with his bare hands. A year later, he returns to marry the Philistine woman and passes the dried skeleton of the lion and finds that a swarm of bees have set up shop in its ribs. From there, he scoops out and eats a bit of honey. Though it's not mentioned here, this is a direct violation of his Nazarite vows. He's not allowed to interact with dead things, dried up bones included, yet there's no punishment. During the wedding feast, Samson proposes a riddle. Anyone who gets it right would get 30 sets of clothing. But if the Philistine guests can't guess the riddle, then they have to pay him. He says, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. After 3 days, when no one could guess the answer, the Philistines told Samson's wife she had to coax the answer from him. They threatened to burn down her father's house if she fails. Eventually, she gets the answer from him and tells her people. When they announce the answer, Samson replies, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have guessed my riddle. Now, I don't think you're supposed to call your new wife a heifer, but since I'm not married, I'm just guessing here. So perhaps comparing your wife to livestock is the key to a happy marriage? So, gentlemen, try it out and let me know how it works out for you. So, Samson loses his bet and he has to pay 30 sets of clothing to the Philistines. Then the spirit of Yahweh entered him. Being a war god, this prompted Samson to go on a murder spree. He went into a nearby city and killed 30 innocent men, stripped their bodies naked, and presented their clothing as payment. He then left in a rage and returned home, leaving his new bride behind. Now at this point, Samson is behaving like a petulant child, but he gets worse. During the wheat harvest, he goes to visit the woman he abandoned, but upon his arrival at her house, he is told by her father that she was now married to one of Samson's companions who was a guest at his wedding. This, according to Samson, justifies his hatred for the Philistines. So, to be clear, one of Samson's Israelite buddies married the woman that he wanted, so this gives him reason to attack the Philistines. And how exactly does he attack them? By running out, capturing 300 foxes, tying their tails together, lighting them on fire, and then releasing them into the wheat fields. The burning foxes set all the wheat fields ablaze, along with the vineyards and olive trees. And that leaves us to wonder, how long did it take him to catch 300 wild foxes? The entire episode is symbolic of how the sun withers grain, a subject remarked upon frequently in Near Eastern literature and mythology. Of course, the Philistines decide to take revenge on Samson by murdering the Philistine woman he is not married to. I'm sure this story makes sense to someone, but that person is certainly not me. The death of the woman that Samson didn't want to marry angers the brute, so he tracks down the men who killed her and beats them up. Now, he doesn't kill them, he just attacks them and leaves them alive. This shows that the anger over his dead wife-to-be is less than his anger for people cheating to learn the answer to a riddle. A Philistine army then marches on Judah and demands that they hand over Samson. So 3,000 men from Judah track him down and take him prisoner. They swear to do him no harm and only tie him up. So because of this, Samson surrenders so that he can be handed over. When the Judahites reach the Philistines, we get another sun god reference as divine power courses through Samson, allowing him to set the ropes ablaze, freeing him so he can seize a jawbone and kill 1,000 Philistines. It should be noted here that ancient depictions of this scene, with Samson wielding a curved jawbone lined with teeth, look strikingly similar to depictions of another character from the ancient Near East who is wielding a curved saw lined with teeth. You guessed it, none other than the sun god Shamash. This is also a second version of this story that we've seen in Judges. Earlier, it appeared as the story of Shamgar in Judges 3:31, where that character killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. It's difficult to say which of the two stories came first, but several ancient copies seem to show Shamgar and Samson as being understood as the same character. And the only real difference between those two stories is the weapon of choice. In the case of Shamgar, it's an ox goad. In the case of Samson, it's the jawbone of an ass. Or was it? It turns out that the jawbone doesn't even belong in the story. It's from a poem about the location of Ramoth Lehi that goes, "At Ramoth Lehi, heaps upon heaps. At Ramoth Lehi, I have slain 1,000 men." Ramoth Lehi means hill of the jawbone, which probably described its profile. But somewhere along the way, it was misread into, "With the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of an ass, I have slain 1,000 men." So originally, the character killed 1,000 men near or on a hill named for its resemblance to a jawbone, with no mention of the weapon used. So this could easily have been the Shamgar story. But when the name of the hill became the type of weapon used, it then contradicted the Shamgar account, which had him using an ox goad. With a second version on their hands, the compilers did the only thing they could think of. They dropped the story into the Samson narrative. We've already seen them do this exact thing with the story of the patriarch pimping his wife to the ruler of the nation. Was it Abraham in Egypt with the Pharaoh? Or was it Abraham in Gerar with Abimelech? Or was it Isaac in Gerar with Abimelech? 3 different versions, just assign them to different people. After all the hard work of using his solar powers to burn ropes and killing 1,000 people with the worst weapon he could find, Samson was understandably thirsty. So, like Hercules, he drinks water which flowed from a magic rock. This brings us to chapter 16, where we get a story that serves 2 purposes. First, it reinforces the solar imagery of Samson by not only linking him again with the sun god Shamash, but also giving us a clear reference to the rising sun. The second point of note is that it foreshadows the episode at the end of the chapter when he encounters Delilah. The story goes like this. Samson travels down to Gaza to visit a prostitute. While sleeping, a group of men set up an ambush at the town gate with the intention of killing Samson at dawn. Presumably, these men are in a guard post up above the gate, which was pretty common in walled towns and cities at the time. And the story only makes sense if this is the case, because Samson somehow knows of their plans, and he tears down the gate posts of the city, just as Hercules does, and carries the entire structure up a nearby hill with his would-be attackers still inside. He then deposits it there on top of the hill to the east of the city, where it remains to this day. The tale is meant to explain a pair of standing stones, possibly with a horizontal capstone bridging the gap between the two, on a hilltop near the city. This pair of standing stones, which resembles the Pillars of Hercules, marks the position of the sun as it rises in the morning, and it being the gates of a city recalls the story of Shamash, who, according to myth, carries the sun through the gates of heaven every morning to march across the sky along his western course. This story of Samson venturing into a city at night and emerging at a hilltop where the sun rises parallels the harrowing of hell theme we see in the tales of Orpheus, Hercules, and Jesus. Our hero enters a dark and hostile world through its confining gates and returns once more, usually victorious over the forces of death. In the story of Christ, he overcomes death itself, and in Samson, he escapes his own death by outwitting his attackers. These are all stories that symbolize the nightly descent of the sun into the underworld before returning at dawn. It was actually believed that the sun would sink into a well in Libya each night, just as Shamash was believed to exit the world through a set of doors somewhere far to the west. We also see here that, when in the company of a woman, Samson is not safe. His wife coaxed the answer to the riddle from him. The prostitute kept him in the city while men plotted an ambush, and Delilah will ultimately discover his weakness. It's all very reminiscent of how Hercules and Enkidu were also betrayed by women. The parallels between Samson and other Mesopotamian divine strongmen keep piling up. Later in chapter 16, Delilah steps onto the stage as the new woman of Samson's interest. Many books of Bible stories claim that Delilah was a Philistine woman, but her nationality is never mentioned in the book of Judges. The Philistine lords each offer her 1,100 shekels of silver if she can coax the secret of Samson's strength from him. This is a replay of the Philistine woman coaxing the riddle of the lion from Samson, again for the benefit of the Philistines. Each night she asks Samson how to overcome his strength. The first night he tells her that if he is bound with 7 tendons, he'll be unable to break free. While he sleeps, she ties him up with 7 tendons and alerts the Philistines. Of course, he bursts free and they retreat. Now that it's clear she's going to try whatever trick he tells her in an attempt to betray him, he tells her another lie. The second night they're together, he tells her that he must be bound with new ropes. Again, he bursts free. The third night, he says she must tie his 7 locks of hair together. She does just that, securing his hair to a peg. Again, he gets free. Just as in the story of the Philistine bride, the Philistines have 3 nights of failure, followed by a 4th in which the woman of his interest is able to coax the truth out of him. In Judges 16:15, she asks how he can possibly claim to love her if he refuses to confide in her. Now, I'd think that her behavior thus far proves her to be untrustworthy, but Samson is not that clever. Despite 3 attempts on his life in as many nights, he straight up tells Delilah that if she cuts his hair, it will negate his Nazarite vow and render him helpless. After saying this, he promptly falls asleep. Like many characters in the Bible, she shows foreknowledge. Despite being tricked 3 times, she now somehow knows that this is his true weakness and gets paid in advance. Samson's mop gets cut, and the Philistines overpower him. It states that the Spirit of Yahweh had left him because the vow was broken. So basically, Yahweh abandoned Samson because Delilah broke a vow that Samson's mother had made. It makes about as much sense as anything else in this story. The solar imagery then kicks into high gear as the symbolic locks, which represent the rays of the sun, are shorn from his head, and his eyes are gouged out, thrusting him into darkness, and he's dragged underground into the dungeon. The night, symbolized here by Delilah, a name derived from the name Layla, which means night, triumphs over the sun and reigns above ground while Samson's life becomes dark and wretched in the underworld. Then things really get interesting. How? By the addition of a detail in this story, but I'll get into that in a moment. At the end of chapter 16, the Philistines are worshiping in the temple of Dagon, singing their praises and thanking Dagon for delivering Samson to them. Now they should have been thanking Delilah, but that's how worship goes. During the church service, they have Samson brought up from the dungeon. And where do they place him? If we take a quick glance back at the first half of the chapter, when the Philistine enemies plot against him during his previous descent into darkness, we can anticipate the ending of this scene. Just as he rose triumphant between the gate posts of the city of Gaza to overcome his enemies in 16:3, we again see the sun rising between two stone pillars in 16:25. During his time in the darkness, his hair had been growing and his strength returns. So he is once again strong when he steps forth into the light. And as he did, between the two stone pillars, he vanquishes the darkness, which was now represented by the Philistines. He tore down the temple, and it is said, killed more people with his death than he had in his entire life. It concludes by telling us that after leading Israel for 20 years, Samson is buried by his family. There's a slight problem with this detail, however. At no point in the entire story of Samson is he ever depicted leading anyone. He never ascends to a throne, is never voted the leader of Israel, is never followed by any group of people. The only time he interacts with any large group of Hebrews is when the Judahites go to arrest him and hand him over. The idea that he is a judge or even just a tribal leader does not match the story at all. The entire story is centered around the town of Beth Shemesh, which means house of the sun, a site that is devoted to the sun god Shamash that I've mentioned so many times already in this episode, the same place where the little stone seal was found just a few years ago, bringing us full circle, right back to the sun god whose stories were borrowed to form the character of Samson. And thus concludes our story of Samson. I'll have one more episode covering the book of Judges, and then... Oh, wait a second. I almost forgot about that one little interesting detail. Remember when I said that the story got a little more interesting when Delilah captured Samson? Yeah, that's it. The Samson story, as it was originally told, may have been anti-Philistine, but it certainly wouldn't have been anti-Dagon, as the fishy god was widely worshipped throughout Israel and Judah in that period. And people certainly weren't going around destroying his temples. Writing such a story would have been blasphemous. So what's up with the story culminating with the destruction of Dagon's temple? The answer to that actually lies in the intro to episode 27, the son of Dagon. In Joshua 13:3, we get a list of the 5 cities that those evil Philistines ruled from. They include Gaza, where Samson tore down the gate, along with Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. But it's the 5th city that's important here, and the clue that explains this late addition to the story, this redaction that lists the Temple of Dagon as the structure that Samson destroys. Originally, It was some generic temple, or perhaps a royal palace in one of the aforementioned cities. But after Dagon worship fell out of fashion, the deity and his worshippers were vilified, just as Samson was demoted from the status of a sun god to a folk hero. And then, the Temple of Dagon, in the city of Ashdod, the fifth Philistine city, mentioned in Joshua 13:3, added the final detail to the Samson story. It was then pasted into the text. The setting changed to the Ashdod Temple of Dagon, and the story was finalized. And this brings the completion date of the final version of the Samson tale to sometime after 147 BCE, when the Temple of Dagon in Ashdod was destroyed. And this means that the book of Judges was still being redacted when the Hebrew Bible was finally in the process of being translated into Greek, showing once again that the story and the theology was growing and evolving even at such late a date. So I'll have one more episode devoted to Judges. Until then, please like us on Facebook at facebook.com/dragonsandgenesis, where you can send me any questions or comments you might have. Subscribe and give us a good review on iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts. And the announcement. Those of you who follow the show on Facebook may have noticed something strange going on with the logo recently. That's because I've decided to freshen up the look of the page. The tired old logo and cover picture have both received an overhaul with a fresh new look. Those bits of artwork came from the project I've been teasing recently. If you'd like to see a larger version of the new logo, you can check it out at the official website for the podcast, which is finally operational. Head over to dragonsandgenesis.com to get a look at the About page, where you can learn more about the podcast and yours truly, a contacts page that allows you to ask questions that will be answered in upcoming episodes, and most importantly, a resources page filled with books, podcasts, lectures, and other material used in the show and crucial for understanding this fascinating subject. I hope you find the site useful. That's it for today. Thank you for listening.